Chapter 19. The Hounds Are Loose. It had been nearly an hour since they had arrived at Dolph's place in the back of the truck and heard the layout of Dolph's plan to help the team get to the NP1 site. They still had not yet heard from Dolly. Due to the nature of Dolph's legitimate business, they were constrained to the back office that belonged to Dolph. Chet had followed them to the back as Dolph laid out the game plan he had put together for them. All in all, it was a flimsy plan at best. Dolly had yet to show or call Dolph with an update on her arrival. Even once that part was done, they then had to get to the outskirts of Montreal and meet up with a pilot who would help get them to a small town outpost called Alert that was considered the farthest north permanent human settlement. Once they made it to Alert, he was to take them to an outpost in the Arctic that would be unoccupied. From there, they were meant to find the rest of the way to the North Pole, where the power plant known as NP1 was located on their own. They could only hope that this power plant would provide answers to their questions. Why were the elites of the world allowed to avoid the use of Chembal when everyone else was expected to take it? Why did every type of modern technology take the energy locked within humans to power the world as they knew it today? Most of all, why was so much of that energy being sent and stored in the NP1 site? David's drive to get answers to these questions were making him antsy, and he was having a hard time sitting still. He had come all the way from STL in the Central West Commonwealth to Montreal in the Great East Commonwealth that once was Canada. He paced a small section of the back office as Ashley sat down with Trace to help prep the tech they brought along. They were planning a similar job to that of the DOE hit. By wearing early 20th century military-grade headcams, they would film and stream everything they saw inside the power plant to a data source. That same data source would be used to store any and all intel they could squeeze out of the power plant's computers if they could break through any firewalls they have in place. That part worried Trace most. DOE looked easy because I had the FWKs that were created specifically for their systems. He told all of them once in the back of the old pawn shop in DC after they decided they would hit NP1. No one knows what a power plant firewall looks like. No one even knows if there is a firewall, the grade level of its protection. We could get in there and no amount of FWK framework or skill on my end could hack through. He continued. At the time, they all agreed that Trace would take the framework from FWK used in the DOE, along with any other lower-grade FWKs he thought may be of use, and do what he could once they got inside, if they even could get inside at all. Brick was standing by a small filing cabinet in the musky back office, like a stone wall. The room smelt like the smoke of those cheap filtered cigars and processed synth beef that you find in tubes, much like many other road meat snacks. David finally stopped and turned around to face Dolph. "What's the deal here, man? Is your girl ghosting us?" he asked. Trace and Brick looked up and over at Dolph to see his reply. To say everyone in their little group was paranoid would be an understatement. Dolph looked up at David from his desk papers of inventory and other business-related documents. "I will admit, it's odd she hasn't shown or called, but it feels like you are implying she or I plan to sell this job down the river to the feds, or the SDT. I got news for you, bucko. To sell your plan down the river would also be to sell the organization down the river, something I, or Dolly, would die before doing," Dolph said. "Then what do you think the deal is here?" David asked, moving closer to Dolph's desk. Brick unfolded his giant arms and stood upright, clearly helping David set up an element of possible danger, which he silently appreciated. Dolph leaned back in his cheap-stained office chair, throwing up his hands. "Look, I get this is a high-risk job. Biggest one in our history if it can happen. I'll call her Burner and see what happens," Dolph said, and reached for a burner in a drawer in the desk he sat at. He punched in a few numbers into the phone and put it up to his ear. There was a moment of silence in the room as Dolph waited for the phone to be answered. Then his eyes and face reacted as if the phone was picked up. "Hey girl, what you up to? Got some guests here for you." I see. All right, well, I understand. Don't worry. Take it easy, eh?" Then Dolph hung up the phone and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk and putting his palms on his eyes. He didn't say anything for a brief moment. "We got an issue," Dolph said simply, as he kept rubbing his eyes with the palms of his hands. "What's the issue?" asked Ashley, looking away from the tech she and Trace were working on. David felt a lump fall down into the pit of his stomach. She's got a tail. Could be hounds. She's pretty sure of it, actually. Dolph said in a voice that had a sliver of frustration in it. David raised his eyebrow. A tail? He echoed. In truth, David was sure in common street lingo, this was a way to say someone was tailing her, aka following her. But with the organization, he wanted to be sure that he had that right. But Trace spoke up before Dolph or anyone else to point it out to him. Bullshit, Trace said. She's a nobody, right? Why the hell would hounds be tailing her unless they knew something was up? He said. David looked over at Trace, then back to Dolph. He wasn't sure what the hounds were, but judging by both men's frustrations, it wasn't good. Nobody knows but the people in this room, Dolly, your pilot, and a drummer boy, up and alert, waiting to come along. But I told you Dolly was good when you first got here, but not on the level D is. That's because D almost always can get in and out of a place and not be ID'd. Dolly's not so lucky. Although she moves around a lot to avoid being recognized, there's always a chance she can get noticed by people like the hounds. They are tailing her, not you and your job. Dolph replied. What are the hounds? Ashley asked, saving David the breath. Dolph looked over at her. Shocked you don't know, he said. Brick spoke up now. She's new to the scene. They ain't wise to everything yet. Dolph nodded his head. Right. Well then. Hounds, simply put, are bounty hunters. Bunch of would-be ultra-patriotic members of our proud union. The types who believe the government has their best interests at heart, or just brain raiders who use the capture of terrorists to pay for their next fix. In their own way, they are kind of like us. There are bands of them working with each other. Not so much with other groups of hounds, though. Most of them don't take Chembal in the conventional sense of the drug, and the SDT and feds look the other way, since they have gotten a few big stings out of the hounds in the past. David rolled his head around on his neck in annoyed frustration as he rolled his eyes. What did she say exactly then? David asked. Dolph looked over at David. She spoke in code. I know she's being tailed. He replied. That's great, but what did she say, man? David said again, coming forward even more towards the desk. She said, Hey, Rudy. That lets me know she's got people around her that she can't use my real name. She followed that up with, just left a dive bar, lot of dogs out here tonight. Think I'll try the gin din. That's her way of telling me she's got hounds tailing her, and she's going to a dive bar in public until she can find a way to lose them, Dolph said. David thought about it for a moment, then looked over at Brick, who did this kind of nod with his head. Then David looked back at Dolph. Tell us where the gin din is. Brick and I will get her here, David said. Ashley stood up from her seat. What the fuck are you talking about? The shock in her voice made David jump a little. He looked over at her, with his eyes open wide. She almost never spoke like that. Why would you risk this entire thing just to get one person here quicker? She's been around the block, David. We just have to wait is all, she said. He looked back at her. He could tell she was frustrated with him. Look, the longer everything sits still, the worse our chances get. Once the SDT picks up our trail again, we lose our ride to the Arctic. They learn where we are heading. We must move quicker than our opponents. The hounds won't see Brick and I coming if we go in. We get Dolly. We get back here. We head out to the private strip, and we keep moving. He said he was hoping to calm her down. She just stood there, opposite him, defiance in her posture and face. No, she said firmly. David paused and considered the options ahead of them. All right. Well, what if we just head out to the airstrip without Dolly then? David said. Dolph cleared his throat. Well, that's a slight problem. You need Dolly to get on the bird, Dolph said. David looked at him with his brow raised. The hell you are talking about? How does she have any connection to the plane or helicopter? He asked. Well, the pilot that operates that private airfield goes by the name Bannon. Bannon is an elderly man, mostly out of the game, so to speak. The main reason he stepped away was about 3 years ago or so, his son got popped on a job and shipped off to be reassigned. Dolly was married to Bannon's son. The only way we ever get his ass to do anything is if Dolly is in. No Dolly, no plane. Our plan is a non-starter until then, said Dolph. Ashley turned to face David. If you really want to go chasing after this girl to speed this job along, it's not going to be just you and Brick. We all go, she said, speaking also for Trace. who immediately stood up when she said, "We all go." "Whoa, whoa, whoa, who the fuck said I wanted to go?" Trace said. Ashley didn't even give the red-headed hacker time to continue his opposition. She turned around with fire and anger in her eyes. "We are a goddamn team, Trace. One of us go, we all go. One of us fails, we all fail, right? So if Brick and David are going out to save another member of this team, we can't stop them from being foolish in that regard. Maybe we can help keep them alive out there," she said in a tone that commanded attention. David realized why she wasn't acting this way out of team loyalty. It was because of him. She was worried about him, much like how he was when she went off with Dee at the DOE job. Because he could register this worry, he didn't push back on her wanting to go as a team. Trace closed his eyes hard and stuck his jagged nose up to the ceiling. He knew she wasn't going to back down and that he would have to go. "Well, this is all inspiring and everything, but you four do realize the Hounds will know who the four of you are, right?" Dolph cut in. "This could end in a bit of a fight if you really want to go and brave the night streets of Montreal to get Dolly out of her pinch." David walked over to his bag, grabbed his pistol and a couple of rounds. "If it comes to it, it comes to it," he said. The four of them got directions from Dolph on how to find the gin den. About 15 minutes away from the truck depot, he ran. They geared up with easy-to-conceal weapons, which was really all David was able to use with a hand in a cast. They followed Dolph to an emergency exit next to his office and gave them the keys to an early 2000s model car. "One of the last gas runners," Dolph said with a smile on his face. "She's fucking beaut, eh?" David took the keys and the four got in and started along the route that Dolph had given them. David's heart was beating fast. He had taken some Tylenol like everyone else had before they took off. This rescue mission was going to lead them straight into an area full of electrical crap that would pull on their heads to suck out little bits of their energy, and they needed to be able to focus. Plus, for David, he hoped it would alleviate some pain in his left hand for a time. But that didn't stop him from being nervous about this whole thing. They needed to get Dolly out of the hot seat as quick as possible. They needed to keep the upper hand on this job, but this could blow up everything. They couldn't afford that, not when they are so close. Trace was stuffed in the back with Brick as they drove through the city at night, looking at a small corner of paper Dolph had ripped off a larger piece of paper and written Dolly's number on. The plan was simple in its design. Get to the gin den, slip into an alley nearby or behind the dive bar, call her, get her to come out to the area they were at, and deal with her tail in the shadows. In theory, they would have the jump and could take out the Hounds quickly before anyone really knew what happened. Ashley sat in the front passenger seat giving David the directions to the bar as he drove. David was going the speed limit to avoid any suspicion, but it took a lot of self-control to refrain from moving as quickly as he could. He looked out to the streets to get an idea of what Montreal looked like. He had never been to this part of the world, and in truth, besides a few military bases in his early years, he had never been anywhere besides the town he lived in. Montreal was like a cleaner version of STL. The city lights were bright and helped show off that at least the face of the city was well maintained. They made sure the roads were kept clean of trash, and if there were tweakers or other lower parts of society in the city, they did not come to this part of town. Tonight looked like the night the college-age and young professional crowds were out to participate in what David thought was pretend socializing. David had dubbed this ritual to be pretend socializing mainly due to the fact no one on these streets would drink too much. They wouldn't flirt too aggressively, and absolutely no one who was on Chembal would be getting laid tonight. Only the small group of the mega wealthy, if any, was even in Montreal, would be out getting their kicks. But most of these fun-loving people were out here tonight to create opportunistic photos to add to emotionally empty social media accounts. Their primary object was to possibly attract another near-empty-minded person to continue to follow in the footsteps of the pre-created path of being married somewhere in your late 20s to early 30s. Having maybe one kid, although with the new drug they were releasing to the public maybe even two kids, after a long period of near-empty marriage. Both will get jobs in which they work just hard enough to keep their minds active, but not hard enough to need real critical thinking. It all made David sick seeing it on this side. He spent so much of his life being one of them. Although in truth, even as one of them, he was so void of any feeling he realized now he really wasn't part of the rat race. His social media accounts were always barren. He struggled with wanting to follow trends of the times. Trends like the beard-growing thing that Simon from his office did when he met some girl on one of those apps. "Left up here, David," Ashley said, and David slowed down at the light, flipping on his blinker and then turning left. He thought about Ashley and her life before this. After all, she did have a version of that life. She had busy social apps, with photos showing how much fun she had been having in her youth. She, like so many others in this world, followed the trends to attract a mate. The major difference was she bent rules. Something most of these people didn't even think of, let alone do. He realized that may have been what attracted her to him and he to her. David didn't use social media apps very well. His photos were old and typically shoddy. He didn't grow a beard when it became trendy, partly because he couldn't grow a full one anyway, and partly because he didn't care much for that look. He was in his own extremely controlled and neutered way, bending the social norms too. He realized that must have been intriguing to her. "It's coming up on the right on this street," Ashley said again. David looked down the street some and saw several neon signs hanging ahead. He slowed down to look closer as they passed down the street. Then, just as she had said, it appeared on the right, a small little thing of a building, with a yellow neon sign that simply read, "Jindin, open." They slowed to a stop, and all looked out the window at the building. "Well, what's the play then?" asked Trace in the back. David looked out to either side of the small building. Both sides were connected to the adjoining buildings, however. The building on the left, the Cookie Mart, had an alley that led to the back. "There," David said. "We can park the car close by, go in that way. You call Dolly. Tell her to go into that back alley. Then we deal with her tail in there." Brick's head nodded, and Trace took a deep breath. Ashley looked away from the building to the three men in the car. "Right, let's get our gear and park the car," she said. David moved the car forward to find a parking spot. They found one just a little way up from where they were and moved the car into it. They all got out of the car. The air was cold from the Canada night air, and there was a thick tenseness to it. There were a couple people babbling about something as they all got on the sidewalk and made their way back towards the Jindin. Once they were back towards the alley, they turned and began walking into the narrow and dimly lit path. It led to a bigger section of alley that interconnected to others, no doubt at some point before Chembal. These back alleys were frequent areas that the young and restless did any and everything they weren't supposed to be doing. Tonight, it would be used by them to do anything and everything to get the Hounds off Dolly. "Call her," David said to Trace as they stopped moving. Trace pulled out his burner and punched in the number given to him by Dolph. He put the phone up to his ear and listened for a response. "Hey," Trace said suddenly. "Dolly? Right. Look, don't say much. You got your tail still?" "Uh-huh, you at the gin still?" "All right. Pay your tab if you got one. Head on out, and there's an alley by that cookie store next to the gin. Follow it to where it opens up, and if your tail comes with you, we will handle it." He hung up and looked at the rest of them. "All right, man. If she didn't get the hint, then I don't know what you want to do aside from waltzing into the damn bar guns blazing," Trace said. They waited about 10 or 15 minutes in the near darkness of the old alley. David realized as his eyes adjusted to the darkness that while it must not be common for people to come back here, there was still a lot of garbage that had accumulated back here. Those lovely clean streets were merely fronts for the filth and decay of the back alleys, hidden by the neon lights similar to filters used on social media to cover up the shallow and vacant faces. They were greeted by footsteps coming down the alleyway they had entered, and they quickly moved to face the approaching person. A woman, maybe 30-something, was moving swiftly towards them. Her hair was strawberry-colored, but there was no way to tell if it was natural. Her skin was dark. She wore a hoodie and spandex fabric leggings. Besides her age range, she could have very well played the part of a college student just walking around on a night like this. She reached them. "Which one of you called me then?" she asked. Her accent wasn't Canadian, maybe West Coast like California area. There was a small hint of Valley Girl in her accent. David was shocked someone that looked and sounded like that would be the woman they were here to bring on a job. He spoke up before Trace did. "You Dolly?" he asked. She looked at David. Her hands were in her hoodie pockets, and he realized she might have a weapon hidden in those pockets for easy access. "I don't know," Your voice ain't the one from the phone call is all I know, she said. It was me, Trace said, moving forward. If you're Dolly, where's your tail? Did you lose them already? Trace asked. Or did you even have one? Asked David. He was growing concerned. If this was a trap, they were screwed. The woman smiled at him with perfect Valley Girl white teeth that bounced off her skin, making both her tan and white teeth stand out intentionally. You must be the guy Dolph mentioned, Dave Nash or something, right? She said. David's eye twitched. It's David, not Dave. No one calls me Dave. Where's the tail? He asked again, growing more concerned. Suddenly, 3 men turned the corner quickly, and the woman looked halfway over her shoulder. Speak of the devil, he shall appear. Am I right? She said. David could hear the men whispering as they moved in closer. His heart began to race. If this was a setup, it could have been worse. In all 4-on-4 were at least even odds. If she really was Dolly, that meant 3 against 5. Answer now, before your friends get here. You Dolly or what? He snapped at her quickly. She nodded. I am Sugar, and those boys are the hounds I need to either chase off or put down. You ready for what comes? She asked. David nodded, and before she turned to face the approaching men, she looked down at his left hand, and then at Brick. The men got about 15 feet away or so, still fairly close to the entrance of the alley they all had come from. Then the man in the middle spoke up. Howdy, friends, he asked, with a twang in his voice. He was wearing a trucker cap, was tall, not as tall as Brick, but over 6 foot, was lanky, and had a long neck. His face was covered with dirty-looking scruff he clearly didn't keep up on. One of the men with him was a man of average build. The other was more frumpy. Couldn't complain until you turned that corner, buddy, David said with an edge in his voice. He knew what they were there for, and they knew what he was there for. It was a matter of fact, no need to bullshit. The tall one snickered a little. Oh, pretty tough sounding feller. But unless you got biz with that little lady there, we don't got no biz with you, he said. David could see the outline of gun belts on all 3 men. I don't think we have to play this cock-tease game dillweed. We got business with the woman, which means we got business with your deliverance ass too, David said. He knew his reference was lost on the tall, goofy man. Then one of his partners, the stout, frumpy one, took in a sharp inhale of breath and leaned over to the tall one. Reese, that there is that Mexican giant. From D.C., and that pretty one is the bitch from that job too. The one you talking to is the leader, Dave Nash, he said in a thick, fat voice. David rolled his eyes, but he wasn't going to waste the energy on them to correct the name thing. Most likely they or him would be dead shortly. The tall one, called Reese, looked over at David, sizing him up. You sure? He asked the fat one. Yeah, look at that big Mexican he got with him, his fat companion said. Then Reese smiled. Well, ain't this a night? We gonna get rich, boys, said Reese. Uh-huh. And tell me, how do you plan on getting rich tonight, Captain Yeehaw? David asked. He was buying time to slowly reach for his pistol. Reese looked back at him. 'Cause asshole, the SDT got a price on your head. Alive, you are worth $60,000 hard cash. This was a shock to David, but he had to ask a serious question about the price tag on his head. That before or after taxes? He asked the man, who looked at him dumbly. Then David pulled out his pistol and aimed it down right at the slender, tall man. He let off 2 shots. The first one missed, he was sure of it. The second struck him in the shoulder. Then the other 2 men pulled out guns as they tried to duck for cover. Reese slid over into cover as well and yelled out at his 2 companions. No kill shots on the Doe 4. We need them alive. David realized that meant one of 2 things. They either had tranq rounds or they were going to try and subdue them with non-lethal shots. The second option was a risky route. Then he heard over the sound of Brick, Ashley, and Trace's gunfire, the man talking, but talking more silently than he previously shouted to his 2 companions. Suddenly, at the entrance of the alleyway, 3 trucks pulled up covering the entrance and removing it as an easy escape route. In each truck, 4 more men got out, and David realized the numbers went from 5 against 3 to 5 against 15 or more, even. A mixture of tranq bullets and live rounds came down on the 5 of them. Fall back, came Trace's voice. David looked back and saw the 4 of them making a break into the maze of dark alleys. He did the same. This went against everything they planned. They all took separate ways. David was following behind Ashley, but besides her, he saw no one else. They either went down other alleys or fell under fire as they turned to run. David heard shouting from behind as they ran down the dark alley. He turned with his right arm extended out to shoot suppressing fire if needed. Then the world turned upside down for him. It was something slippery was all he could tell with certainty. It was maybe rotting trash or a dead wild animal, he wasn't sure, but it was enough to make him slide and then slip. With the right half of his body extended towards his back, he put his left hand forward reactively. The sheer pain of his body weight landing on his left hand and fingers nearly caused him to black out, as the white-hot pain burned up the entire left side of his arm. He let out a shriek of agony and began to try and get up, but he didn't consider just how much that pain had impacted his responsiveness. He stumbled over himself as he tried to stand, then he felt it. A small prick-like feeling shot into his lower calf on his right leg. He looked down and saw a tiny little silver dart. He pulled it out and stared at it in absolute horror. He had been tranked. He tried to stand again but stumbled, the narcotic already making his right leg useless. A bunch of faceless men circled him, and then the one called Reese appeared. He was nursing his left shoulder. "Get me them military-grade handcuffs, Perry," he barked at one of the men. One man handed over a pair of handcuffs that Reese slapped over David's left wrist, and then dragged the tranked and faint David over to some piping on a building. He wrapped it around the pipe and cuffed David's right hand. "Don't go nowhere, Nash. I'm going to go catch your bitch and buddies. Then we will go see the SDT," said Reese. He ran off in the direction Ashley had disappeared in, as the other 3 men with him followed. David could feel the trank moving through his body, but he tried to shake out of the cuffs. He was panicking, he was falling unconscious, and everyone was being bagged and tagged by the hounds in the alleys for all he knew. He couldn't get out of the cuffs, and he couldn't focus enough to see any other options. Then, there was someone near him. He felt it. As he staggered back and forth trying to fight the trank's effects, he saw Brick's face. "Brick!" he said in a dazed and sluggish voice. "Help! Tranks! Cuffs! Ashley!" He couldn't form sentences anymore, and the tunnel vision was settling in. Brick looked around to make sure the hounds were far away enough to put his attention on David. He stepped closer. It was hard to tell at this point, but David thought he looked like he may have blood on him. Brick looked at the cuffs and the piping it was wrapped around. "Bad news, boss. This is military grade, reinforced metals. I don't think I can't snap them like the ones at DOE. I don't know how the Hicks have them," he said. "The pipe," David said. He was starting to fall backwards as the cuffs kept him standing. Brick studied the pipe and where it went into the building. Then he looked back in the direction where the hounds had gone. Another voice spoke. "We gotta move. If he's stuck, he's stuck. We either get him out quick or not at all." It was a Valley Girl type of voice, but he couldn't see anyone. "All right, I think I can get him out quick," Brick said. He pulled out a knife that would have been huge in another person's hands. He aimed it down towards the steel of the cuff attached to David's left cast-covered hand. Then the trank took full effect. David's eyes fluttered shut as Brick lifted his arm up and down with untraceable speed. As David fell into a forced sleep, it felt like he was falling towards the ground.